Palworld is a monster taming survival sandbox that is releasing both on Steam and Xbox Game Pass on January 19th, 2024. I've had the opportunity to play the game early and have put dozens of hours into it, exploring the vast open world, interacting with the base building, crafting, and management mechanics, battling the various tower leaders and alpha bosses, and a whole lot more. In today's video, we are going to be dissecting Palworld under a critical lens and discussing whether or not I think the game is worth it based on its merits. If you're new to the channel, I am a monster taming creator who covers monster taming games as my major focus. These can include games like Palworld, Pokemon, Digimon, Coromon, Nexomon, Dragon Quest Monsters, SMT, Monster Sanctuary, etc, etc, etc. And one thing that you will be receiving in this review, however, is a fair and honest interpretation of the game that doesn't try to put it up against Pokemon, or a review that tries to degrade Pokemon in favor of this game. We are instead going to be looking at Palworld as a standalone title itself, because in all actuality, Palworld is a much more similar game to something like Ark Survival Evolved and other sandbox titles than it is to any Pokemon game I've ever played. Today we're going to be looking at the game from the lens of a monster taming fan and discussing its three major aspects, including the combat system, the exploration and world, and the base building and crafting mechanics. It is important to note that the game is in early access, so do expect there to be bugs, which we'll talk about, and note that the game is not fully complete, as there are content updates planned that'll bring it to full release throughout the year. When the game does fully release, we will be putting out a full game review, and I will be keeping you guys up to date on all of the news regarding any future updates, and of course expect tons of guides, breakdowns, and more leading up to and through the early access release. After you watch the video, if you like what you see and want more Palworld and monster taming content, make sure to subscribe, and without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so first things first, as mentioned, Palworld is a very different game from something like Pokemon. This is not a story-driven game. In fact, the story is pretty much non-existent, unless you want to dive into the diary logs that you can find scattered throughout the world. But essentially, you wake up on this sort of post-apocalyptic island where pals, aka the creatures of these games, roam free and aren't as friendly as you might think. When you get started, you basically start with nothing and will have to work your way up by building a crafting table, then a base, then eventually pal spheres, and more. We'll talk more about the crafting and base management stuff in a bit, so let's skip that part and go to where the action happens first. The combat system in Palworld is essentially a third-person shooter with role dodging mechanics similar to action RPGs like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, but not nearly as intricate as those games. You can control the human player utilizing various weapons, most of which will start out as very simplistic, like your fists or spears or whatever, and will get more intricate as you build up your arsenal, eventually wielding items like rifles, shotguns, and more. But since it's a survival game, you'll have to work your way up to it, and it's not going to be easy to get those weapons. The pals that you capture are controlled by AI, with the exception of situations where you can either mount them or they could become part of your weapon arsenal through monster abilities, which can be unlocked as you level up, gaining points called technology points, which will allow you to unlock basic recipes for different things, including these abilities. Then you can craft them at your base. Pal partner abilities can range from mounting land, sea, or air creatures to really cool mechanics like Liftmonk's machine gun while mounted on your head, or using this little guy as a grenade, and everything in between. I'm sure that many of you guys have seen the trailers for this game, which of course some of these scenes are more cinematic, but all of the brutality involving the combat system is here. You can shoot and kill enemy pals, you can butcher and eat your own pals, you can use them as shields, etc. This is a game that showcases the true reality of what a world with magical creatures would actually be like. People would exploit these creatures, people would keep them captive, and you can choose whether or not you want to be someone who takes advantage of your monsters or fights alongside them. I will say that in some aspects the game's combat did feel a little bit janky when getting stuck on certain surfaces and stuff. However, I do enjoy it overall and think it just needs a few tweaks here and there, and maybe a couple extra invincibility frames while roll dodging. The world of Palworld is massive. If you're thinking about exploring it on your feet, just forget about it, because it's just not feasible. You're gonna have to definitely get some mounts. I highly recommend a sky mount, and even then it'll take you a lot of time to get from one area to the next. These types of survival games are made like this with the idea of having many players within a server in mind, so this definitely makes sense. And while I can't give you guys a review of the multiplayer experience, since I was playing on my own. What I can say is that despite the fact that the world is very large, there is a good amount of collectibles, chests, bosses, dungeons, and of course pals scattered throughout the world that keep everything interesting. There are also 5 towers that contain tower leaders that exist, each of whom will mount their pal in battle in order to defeat you. These are difficult boss battles that only give you about 10 minutes to defeat, which means that just surviving against and outlasting them isn't really an option. You have to be able to output enough DPS in order to win the match. There are also alpha bosses scattered throughout the world, which are basically larger pals with better stats, which you can catch or defeat for the purpose of strengthening your own team. You can also find dungeons as well, some of which are somewhat sizable, cave systems containing a boss at the end, whilst others are just a single room denoted by a blue ring on the ground which leads straight to a boss. All of the boss monsters are catchable with the exception of the tower leaders, since there's humans sitting on top of them. Speaking of which, you actually can catch humans, which I thought was kind of funny. You can catch the regular human enemies. They do have a low chance, but you can catch them and force them to defend your base, which that's kind of epic. My only gripe with the exploration present within the game is that it feels like even a lot later in the game, mounts are still very slow in comparison to the vast size of the world. Certain areas also lacked bird statues, which are the means of teleportation in this game, so it was a little frustrating with regards to how far certain resources would be from the nearest bird statue, especially since the game does have a heavy emphasis on base building and crafting mechanics, which means you're going to have to go stock up every once in a while. Finally, last but not least, and I'm definitely going to have to skim over this a little bit and go through the major aspects because of its sheer complexity, but we have the base building and crafting aspect of this game to talk about. So like I stated earlier, you start off with absolutely nothing but your fists and must work from there. You start by building a workbench, then eventually a pal storage system, which allows you to create your own little settlement for your pals, and things just sort of snowball from there. You'll start with relatively simple base missions that task you with creating infrastructure such as beds for your pals so they don't get stressed, a fire to keep yourself warm at night, and of course various weapons and tools like an axe for cutting wood and a pickaxe for breaking through stone. You're going to have to make sure that your pals are fed and don't get too overworked or stressed out, or they can become crazy and attack you. The pals themselves have several different base related abilities. Some of them can cut down trees, others can break through stone. You have some that can move materials from the ground to storage boxes, and you have pals that can plant seeds, ones that water crops. There are even various levels to this. Basically, a monster with, like, let's say a kindling score of 4 is much more efficient than that of a kindling score of 1. Eventually, and of course I'm cutting down a lot on the steps here for the sake of time, but you will be able to create a base that's pretty much self-sufficient. You can have pals grow crops for you and others that can move said crops into feeding bins so that the pals basically just feed themselves in sort of a loop. You do have to be careful though, because even if you're playing on single player mode, your bases can still get raided, and if that happens, you'll see a swarm of pals attack it and potentially destroy your infrastructure. But don't worry, because your inhabitants will strike back. It's important to note that PvP will not be available at the early access release, so I'm guessing human raids will not be available either. As you complete various missions, you will be able to increase the amount of bases you have, which will give you access to more teleportation spots and can allow you to focus different bases on different things. There's honestly so much to talk about when it comes to the bases present within the game that there's no way I could do it in this review, but let me just say that you have a ton of control over what you create and how you decide to utilize your pals. The general gameplay loop of this game is to go out exploring, gathering various resources along the way, and bringing them back to your base in order to increase the size of your base, thus increasing the size of your arsenal. During this time, you'll also go up against bosses, explore the rest of the map, try to complete your pal decks, and when the game fully comes out, you could still enjoy this in a multiplayer PvE format. I do have a few issues with the base building, and these are just bug issues, but I've noticed that sometimes pals have a hard time getting assigned to specific types of work. Basically, you're supposed to pick up your pal and throw it at something, but sometimes for no reason it just says there's no task for it, even when there is. Some pals will get stuck on the edges of the base, which can be quite annoying. Some bases with elevation due to cliffs and whatnot can cause some issues, etc. This game in general has a lot going on, even more so than we discussed in this video. For example, we got a crossbreeding system that allows you to find set crossbreeds in the wild or create them for yourselves, which is pretty cool. Despite the fact that this game isn't perfect and does have bugs, I honestly haven't found anything game-breaking based on my experience. I played on the Steam version and had a relatively smooth time overall, but for those watching my Let's Plays, you will see where there were a few issues here and there later on. Also, I should quickly mention that Palworld offers complete customization over your world. You can literally change things like how long eggs take to hatch, the amount of damage you take or receive, the amount of drops you get on average, the total world drops, how many pals can exist at once in the world, and more. And much like many other systems that we've had to gloss over in this video, I will have several breakdowns for you guys going over all of this in depth. It's been several days since I received my early review copy, and I've seen comments of people saying that the game's not coming out, it's too good to be true, it's not a real game, etc. And I've had to bite my tongue this entire time, but now I can finally say that yes, the game is real, and yes, it's a lot of fun. If you're into monster taming games, if you're into survival games, if you're into action combat games, I think you'll enjoy it. Despite its early access state, I do highly recommend the game. It's only $30 right now, which I'm sure will increase when the game goes into full access, so you do get a little bit of a deal there, and honestly, I think that the game has a lot more content than a lot of complete monster taming games. In early access alone, there are over 100 pals, however, this isn't a turn-based game, so this is more than you think. All of these monsters have their own animations and AI that specifically have to interact with the environment in real time. The game's got a decent amount of weapons to play around with, a ton of pal partner abilities to utilize, a massive open world, and a whole lot more. So yeah, the title of this video is likely something to the effect of, is Palworld worth it? And personally, I have to say yes. I really enjoyed this game. The fact that they gave me an early access key means nothing when it comes to these types of reviews, because generally speaking, and I'm going to be doing this time, I just buy a copy of the game anyway and give it away to one of you guys. So stay tuned for that as well. Other than that, guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any questions about the game, stay tuned. I have a lot of guides coming, and I'll try to get any of your questions answered in the comments too. I'm really looking forward to this game coming out. It really does scratch an itch that I never knew I had, and even after putting dozens of hours into this game, I'm just wanting to dive back into it right now as I'm putting this video together. I also just really can't wait for you guys to get your hands on it too. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel for daily monster taming content and a ton of Palworld videos. You can also check out my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, channel memberships, and more linked below. And special thanks to our supporters, especially Jim Hamilton, Dro Ghost, Candy Marunci, and Tregsoft, and we'll see you next time. Peace.